Good evening and welcome to Bronx Talk. Last week, the New York State Cannabis Control Board approved 36 businesses and not-for-profits for licenses to operate the first retail cannabis dispensaries in the state. 3 of them will be in our home borough of the Bronx. Out of 900 applicants, 28 of the first licenses were awarded to individual businesses, while 8 were given to nonprofits. And coming up next week, the borough president's office is going to host the Bronx Dispensary Showroom at the historic Bronx Post Office on 149th Street, a first-of-its-kind recreational dispensary educational experience in anticipation of the launching of the recreational cannabis market in the Bronx. So tonight, we're going to take a look inside the burgeoning pot industry in the Bronx, who's involved, who can get licensed, and what is the effect this new industry will have on all of us. Please join me in welcoming representatives from a couple of groups who are working on the Bronx Cannabis Hub, and also one of our guests is hopeful to become a licensee. So the co-founder of the Bronx Community Foundation is Desmond Lewis. Nice to have you with us,
Thank
sir.
you for having me, Gary.
And the Chief of Staff of Bronx Defenders is Wesley Keynes. Mr. Keynes, nice to have you with us. And a Bronx business owner, and I'm going to try to pronounce this right, it's CAURD, it's C-A-U-R-D, Conditional Adult Use Retail Dispensary Applicant. He's on Skype with us. It's Howie Miller. He's at his place of business. Nice to have you with us, Howie.
Nice to meet you.
Great, nice to have you. Gentlemen, let's start with you. Mr. Lewis, let's start. What is the Bronx Cannabis Hub? Let's start very general there,
Sure.
And then we'll break it down and get into what everybody's doing.
Sure. So the Bronx Cannabis Hub is a program of the Bronx Defenders in partnership with the Bronx Community Foundation to really try to live up to what OCM and state legislators have been looking to do in the cannabis industry around social equity and prioritizing members of communities most disproportionately impacted by the prior cannabis legislation, meaning those who've been formerly incarcerated or formerly convicted of cannabis. And so the purpose of the hub is to provide support, both legal and educational and advocacy support to individuals in the Bronx particularly that have been harmed by the prohibition of cannabis.
This is a work in progress, so we're not where we're going to be. We will move forward, but starting at point zero to where we are now in creating this Bronx Cannabis Hub, where are we? Where are you in the Bronx Community Foundation in this process?
Well, I think the Bronx Defenders and the Bronx Community Foundation have made a tremendous amount of effort so far as it relates to the Bronx Cannabis Hub. So one of the first things the Cannabis Hub's goal was to do was to support conditional adult use retail dispensary license applicants or card license applicants from the Bronx that have been formerly convicted or formerly incarcerated in the cannabis prohibition prior to the MRTA. And so our first goal with the Bronx Defenders was to support license holders in that process. And so we were able to support about 35 applicants to apply for a license. And that was a huge milestone for the Bronx Defenders and the Bronx Community Foundation. And we were pleased that last week OCM confirmed that 3 of our applicants in the program were awarded in the first 28 conditional adult use license holders.
Mr. Keynes, let's just talk a little bit about the relationship between the two organizations. In my mind, and I know both of you and I know the organizations, you almost do the same thing. Is there a difference, or is this a good association? Just talk about the relationship. And my reason for doing this is because if they're going to be at the center of the hub, if you will, then we want to know who they are and what they're about. So just talk about Bronx Defenders and maybe in relation to the Bronx Community Foundation.
Sure, and doing the same thing, if I'm understanding you to mean that we serve the people of the Bronx and support the people of the Bronx, absolutely we do the same thing in that regard. The Bronx Defenders, though, is a public defender organization, so we represent poor people in the Bronx who are ensnarled in legal systems. That's in the criminal system, immigration system, family regulation system, housing system, and as well as other employment licensing systems of the state and government. The relationship with the Bronx Community Foundation is one that we value tremendously. We began working very closely with the foundation during the advent of the pandemic, in supporting across several different verticals community members who were really left behind in the lockdown that we saw across the country and frankly across the world. It's a relationship that have an enormous amount of respect on both sides. And when MRTA came about and the licensing structures came about, it was an opportunity for us to collaborate again.
It sounds to me like you folks handle kind of the legal side of it, and then they'll handle the social side of it, for want of a better generalization. So then that would mean that you and the Bronx Defenders understand the impact that previous cannabis legislation has had on our communities. Why don't you articulate that? And the reason for doing that is bringing that from the past, how we got to this point where the state felt really, that they had to, license marijuana use for recreational use in New York City and New York State.
So the Bronx Defenders, we celebrated our 25th anniversary this year. And up until the legalization of cannabis via the MRTA legislation, probably the highest category of people we served had to do with being arrested for cannabis possession. So we understand very well how devastating the war on drugs and specifically cannabis has been for the people of the Bronx, mostly black and brown people in the Bronx. And I can tell you that the tens of thousands of black and brown residents of the Bronx who have been saddled with, a history of criminalization that goes into the future of their lives. Like literally, this was a monumentous legislation to have passed to eliminate the ability of them being funneled into the system.
I think it's one of those things that just was under the radar for a long time. I mean, I was reading about it in preparation for this show, and people talking about how because they were incarcerated over smoking a joint, on 149th Street, that they were incarcerated, that their children were removed by ACS. That as you said, that is a life-changing thing. Let's then, this is a good moment to bring in Howie Miller. Howie, just talk about what your interest is and why you, I guess, are somewhat disappointed you didn't get a license in this first round, but it is your desire to move this forward for yourself and presumably your family.
Absolutely. I was arrested in 2005 with some marijuana and convicted and served 18 months, taken away from my family. So I've been affected by it in a strong way. And now that the laws has changed, so to speak, I'm looking for the opportunity to be on board with making a change and being a card applicant, hopefully.
Could you just talk about the moment you were arrested, what you were doing? Was it as simple as what I just said, smoking pot, walking down the block, or was it something more difficult? Is it painful for you to talk about it? I'm just curious. I think people would want to get a sense of reality about what we're dealing with here.
I mean, it was kind of painful when it occurred, and I'm still kind of a little emotionally scarred behind it. But nevertheless, it felt like the whole world just dropped from underneath me, and I felt like a failure to my family and myself. But I was able to get past that and try to strive and move on to become, a better person.
And now you have a construction business, we understand, and your plan is to open a dispensary. I mean, that's what you'd like to do.
Oh, absolutely. I would love to have a car license and open up a dispensary here in the Bronx, where I'm from, and be able to generate generational wealth for me and my family, and not have to look over my shoulder.
Mr. Lewis, let's just talk about the showroom, the Bronx Dispensary showroom. I mean, it kind of makes sense. People like Howie, there are many of them. As I mentioned earlier, there were 900 applicants. If they only, there's probably still about 850 still waiting for the opportunity. Let's just talk about what the plan is for December 9th through 14th. It was somebody said to me it was at the post office, and right away, of
Right.
course, I said 149th Street. That's got to be it.
Correct.
So tell me a little bit about what that's about.
Sure. So coming out of the card application process and working with the Bronx Defenders, the Bronx Community Foundation was looking to figure out what our educational programming would be about. And there were two really big things that came out of learning in the card process. One was many of the card applicants, whilst they may have been to a sort of an illegal dispensary in New York State, they haven't been to a legal one and actually walked into a dispensary. If you think about it, you're applying for an application to run a dispensary, but many
But
of them
you've
have
never
never
even
walked in
seen
one.
one.
Correct. You have to go to Boston. More recently, New Jersey's starting to open up, so you go to New Jersey, or many people fly to California. And so from our community, particularly those that have been most disproportionately impacted, that's a resource constraint. So that was the first thing, right? And then even if you had the chance,
That's
Gary,
almost like, excuse me, it's almost like setting them up for failure. That
yeah,
if you don't have that,
you don't have that
information.
experience. And then the second thing, which was even more sort of surprising, or not surprising, let's say enlightening, is that even if you had been to a dispensary and you had the resource to go to California or Boston, you only made it to the front desk. You never made it behind the counter. So you don't actually know where a majority of the compliance and requirements are to run a dispensary is behind the retail counter. And so we said, as a foundation and as a part of the Cannabis Hub, how can we bring that experience to the Bronx? And that's really what our retail adult use dispensary showroom experience is going to be about. It's
So
about
who should attend?
so anyone that's willing to learn, that wants to learn about the cannabis industry, card applicants who've never seen a retail dispensary,
And maybe
also,
others who have an idea that
Correct.
that's what they want to do.
or that have a stigma or an idea of what it really looks like or thinks what it looks like and has never seen it and really wants to see explicitly what a compliance retail adult use dispensary is going to look like.
Mr. Keynes, one of the things that came up, and I mentioned it at the opening, was the notion of for-profit businesses versus non-profit. What is the difference? Does it mean anything, let's say, to a consumer? And how is that divided up? It's kind of unusual. You say if you're opening an insurance business, well, you're opening an insurance business. You're not opening a not-for-profit insurance business. So just describe the differences between the two.
Well, a for-profit business is motivated by profit, just what it says, right? And in the case of OCM and its issuing of not-for-profit licensing, the idea there is that nonprofit organizations that have been in the community serving people who were criminalized via the war on drugs and around cannabis should also have an opportunity to now have an income stream to help them continue to do that work.
And that's what we heard from Mr. Miller just a moment ago.
Correct.
Right.
So that's the base difference between both business models and why OCM was very keen on making sure that not-for-profit organizations also have to have had a history in the community working with impacted people.
We just heard from Howie Miller that he wants to use it to build wealth for his family. If you're in that not-for-profit situation, you can still make money at it.
Well, there will be money to be made, whether you're in it as an individual, as
I
Mr.
see.
Howell, as an entrepreneur, or whether you're in as a not-for-profit organization. The difference comes down, though, is the non-profit organizations have a history of working with impacted community members and will use this as a way to supplement their income to do that work.
Let's ask Mr. Miller. I'm just curious about this. One of the things that I learned is that they're going to limit the number of dispensaries that you could own. You can't like franchise it and then buy everything up. And I mean, if you're strategic enough, and so it'll. And I thought it was fascinating that it's going to be like liquor stores, that you get a license to run that liquor store, and you can't open, 20 of them. So it kind of was an education for me. Just what do you think of that? I mean, does that discourage you a little bit, or you kind of like that business model that it'll be a homegrown, no pun intended, business?
Yeah, no, I love everything that the OCM is doing. And I'm an entrepreneur businessman, so anything that's going to allow me to make money legitimately, I'm all for.
And so I like the idea of people having personal businesses. I mean, I always try to shop at the local markets instead of the big markets. But anyway, another whole dialogue. I really must ask, and we'll ask everybody this question. We'll start with you, Mr. Keynes. What will New York City and the Bronx look like with many more people smoking pot? People will be smoking pot walking down the street. They'll be gathered in front of their buildings. I mean, we know what life in the Bronx is about. They'll be in the courtyards of public housing, maybe. Young people will be on the basketball courts, and they'll be hanging out, and we'll just see more and more people doing it. People could getting high on their way to work and maybe not be as productive at work or not pay attention. I mean, there's a lot of issues here. Right now, you could be walking down the block, and a car will drive by, and you could smell it out of that car. And you're like, wow, look at this. People are getting high everywhere. What will New York City look like, and are you concerned about that?
I think New York City will look the same way that it looks now.
Really?
I think the difference is until the passing of the MRTA legislation, we had thousands, tens of thousands of mostly black and brown people who were being criminalized for cannabis. And we know from the studies that black and white consumers of cannabis consume at the same rate, but the criminalization happened on the black side, on the brown side. So that's going to be that has been one dramatic difference in what New York City looks like. I think when you think about it and you ask a question as, what will New York City look like? I mean, you cannot smoke cannabis anywhere you cannot smoke cigarettes, right? The same restrictions you have on operating a vehicle while not under the influence of alcohol or other illegal substances, you also have those same restrictions on cannabis. So I think that the idea that cannabis represents a different, distinct harm opportunity is the wrong way to look at this. What New York City will look like is an expanded tax base, people who
There's no question that it will raise more. I mean, I
Yeah.
think that's without question. It will raise more.
Absolutely.
More money
But what's
New York
also
and New York
key,
State. Go ahead.
and what's also key to this legislation is that 40% of the profits, that tax base, will be reinvested by law back into harmed communities of the war on drugs. So I think when you think about what New York City will look like, I think in an ideal sense, I want to think that it will look like more thriving communities, less police and less criminalized communities. And frankly, black and brown people, to Mr. Howell's point, being able to create an economic legacy for their family members. And I think when you have thriving communities, you have individuals and families within those communities that are doing well. And I want to think that in 10 years, we'll look back at this moment and say, this was the right decision. It was long overdue, and the people who had been criminalized through this prohibition period are now the ones who are helping to make sure that their communities are thriving.
I want to ask you a similar question. I was thinking about 1933 when the FDR and the 21st Amendment repealed prohibition. Do you see, and that ultimately turned out well.
No.
I mean, we still have problems. There's always drunken driving and other things, and alcohol has caused problems.
Yeah.
Do you see this in a similar way? Is there a comparison? Obviously, we all raised a lot more money after prohibition was
Yep.
repealed. Organized crime was lessened because it was not a black market.
Yep.
Alcohol was up front. Is there a parallel here that's useful?
I think there are a lot of parallels. I think to Wesley's point, black and brown members of our community, black particularly, are 15 times more likely to be criminalized for cannabis than white counterparts. I think Latino, according to the OCM, the Latin community 8 times more criminalized than white counterparts. And so the simple fact that that will reduce will be extremely powerful. Just trying to make parallels to the New Deal, right? The 1930s and what happened after that. This cannabis industry is going to bring 60 to 100,000 new jobs to the state. There are new industries that are going to be created: cleaning businesses, security companies. There's just so many different non-plant touching.
Anybody involved in opening a store
Yes.
is going to be able to find work
There
around
are
this.
new jobs that don't exist right now that are being created. You also have, to Wes's point, community groups are going to get funded in ways they've never been funded before. I think there will be opportunities for for small business is an economic wealth generation. One of the core tenets of the Bronx Community Foundation is generational wealth building. We're going to see generational wealth building at scales we've never seen before.
The guy on Skype here is
Yeah.
hoping that you're right.
Because simply OCM and the state are prioritizing communities, they call it CDIs, communities disproportionately impacted, and the Bronx, without a doubt, is one of those communities most impacted, and we therefore think this will be extreme positive to
You have
to our
dealt
community.
with healthcare plenty.
Yes.
Concern about asthma and airborne diseases, more people smoking, and certainly if they smoke cigarettes, they have a problem.
Well,
Is that a concern?
Well, I think the health aspects of cannabis being a plant and something that will be positive should be highlighted. I think people should also consider the other impacts of it, right? I think one of the points of our educational series is not to be is to be impartial and be able to give information on what will happen in these situations. But to Wes's point, there's no difference in terms of where you can smoke a cigarette. There's no difference in terms of where you can consume. So all of these things will be the same. And funny enough, just to make a little bit of an aside, where we're hosting our event on December 9th is in the Bronx Post Office, created in the 1930s as a part of the New Deal. And so this event sort of represents that
I don't want to ask if that was intentional.
Well, to keep that,
fortuitous,
but it represents the generational wealth building in this community, and we're also going to be bringing jobs and opportunities. As a part of this event is also a workforce development fair, so we want people to come and sign up for jobs, be trained on cannabis-related jobs. So it's not just about training on the dispensary; it's about bringing opportunities to the Bronx.
Howie, let's just talk a little bit about where you're at in the process, what the process is like. Would you give some advice to somebody who's listening to this and says, well, maybe I want to do something like this? What's your advice and what's your experience been like in applying, and you got rejected or didn't get accepted the first time? So just tell us a little bit about the process.
Well, the process was a daunting task. Gathering
Really?
a lot of documents. Yes, actually it was. I had to gather a lot of documents. It was very time consuming. However, you can see that the OCM raised the bar. They just don't want any and everybody to, be able to get one of these licenses. You have to have prior business experience, and they want to know if you get this license, you can be able to operate a dispensary effectively,
Well,
profitable, and everything.
I find that to be very interesting. So they're really screening people and selecting the right people, not just say, well, you were abused by the system way back, so therefore you get the opportunity, but you've got to come to the table with something.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And where are you at? Is your application completely finished, or is there more to go?
No, my application is submitted, completed. I'm just in the waiting process of
Right.
waiting now.
So we'll go around the room here. Mr. Lewis, how long does he have to wait? What's the next go round? I mean, they did 36 out of 900
Yeah.
last week. Where are we at?
So last week, OCM came out and said that there's most likely going to be a December board meeting. And in that December board meeting, we expect that there will be more licenses to be issued. We're hoping for more than the 36 that were issued in this round. And so we know that OCM is trying to move as quickly as they can because everyone, including Howie and many others, are anxious and want to really know where they stand. And so OCM is committed to move as quickly as they can from a capacity and from a legal standpoint.
It certainly would help people like Howie because he's running his own business, and you kind of want to know if by somewhere in the middle of 2023 I'm going to have something else to handle. Let's just get some final words from you, Mr. Keynes. What's your message really to the people of the Bronx? I guess you're going to invite as many people as possible. We can put that flyer up there again about coming between the 9th and the 14th. Is that 9th to the 11th? Okay.
Yeah.
What's your message here today after they've made the first awards and we're getting ready to learn more about it and educate the public and move forward? What's the message from you?
Yeah, I mean, the message from me is that this is a very exciting time. It's like we're literally at the precipice of like a new era, a new opportunity, one that has recognized past harms and is seeking to redress them in how these licenses are being dispensed. And I think there are very few instances in our country where we can find Black and brown people prioritized in an emerging market. So New York literally is going to be the beacon for the rest of the country, because if it's successful here, we fully anticipate that it could be successful other places. And the goal would be that the federal government would decriminalize and legalize cannabis.
You know, one of the things, my own education in this, and of course studying it in preparation for the show, and certainly learning about it and hearing everything in the media, was this idea that this was kind of bringing a sense of justice to people who felt abused by the system.
Yeah.
My sense is even stronger from hearing from you three gentlemen that this is what I mentioned earlier, something that has flown under the radar for so long, and that while there may be issues like the airborne diseases, some people may not like walking down the street and seeing somebody, smoking pot, but the racial justice component is so vital here that you feel like it's almost like you're getting somewhere. I don't even know how to describe it. Do I get that right?
No, I mean, social equity in cannabis hasn't really worked anywhere in the country. And so New York is taking learnings from other states and, to Wes's point, trying to do things differently here. And so by prioritizing, those that have been most disproportionately impacted, by saying, multi-state operators, companies that come from out of state can't control our market, by saying that, minority and women-owned businesses are to be prioritized. Like New York and the Office of Cannabis Management is doing it very differently, and they are trying to, in many cases, right those wrongs and make sure that communities impacted are prioritized.
And so there's a fine line. You're really riding a line of educating the public,
Yes.
of the right legislation.
Yep.
Presumably both of you, and then we'll even let Howie get the final word. You feel like things are in place, and every time you all learn something else, you say, look, we got to handle it this way. Like the thing is still evolving.
Yeah, I mean, it's very early. And we're still at the early stages of this. And, one of the messages we keep telling people is, this is the very beginning. There's a huge amount of opportunity. Get educated.
Get educated. The 9th through the 11th at 149th Street. So Howie will give you the final word. You're very hopeful, and can I assume you responded to what I was saying about social justice? This is important to you.
My quote is, let's do it legit.
All right. That was great. We didn't have a lot of time, and you hit the nail on the head. So Desmond Lewis, thank you so much, from the Bronx Community Foundation. Wesley Cairns from the Bronx Defenders, thank you.
Thank you.
And we'll thank our producer, Rebecca Hemick. Our director is Will Guzman. And of course, the cast of thousands around us here in the studio and in the control room. Next week, you know what happens. We'll be back. We'll see you next week. Good night. Happy holidays.